Today we're going to have a discussion about which regiments are the strongest for competitive play and give you the best chance of winning when you're in a game of 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to focus on the strength of each guard regiment, and we're going to go through them one by one, talking about the elements that each one can do that the other regiments can't. And for this video, rather than just going over every single bit, we're just going to focus on the bits of the regiment that I think are the things that you want to use in a competitive game of 40k if you're purely trying to beat your opponent's army. If we're focusing it just from a gameplay point of view, and looking just at the models rules wise, then it gets a little bit more ruthless with rules. If one regiment can do what another one can do slightly better, then in general that one will be deemed more competitive. For this video I am just going to focus on the regiments that are available to the standard guard units. This time we're not going to focus on the Scion regiments, although I know that they have some very decent strategies. If you'd like to see a more focused look at the most competitive Scions regiments, then please let me know down in the comments, and I'm sure that's something that we can do in the future. I know whenever we make any sort of these tier ranking type lists, this is largely based on my own opinion, and in a complicated game such as 40k, there are a lot of reasons that people might have different opinions on the strength of the armies, what they've played themselves, their own local meta and what's more useful than that, and people's own individual playstyles as to how they try and win with an army in game. If you think that I've ranked any too high or too low in this list, then please let me know. It's good to get that sort of discussion going down in the comments. With all that being said, we're going to go through each of the regimental choices, including some discussion of the custom regiments, and talk about what assets that they have to bring to the competitive Imperial Guard arsenal. I've broken them down into 3 tiers. The third tier is less competitive. The middle tier I think does some things very well and can be competitive in small numbers, but maybe not as the basis of an entire army for me. And the top tier are ones that I think you could absolutely form an entire guard army out of it and are very powerful in game. So without further ado, let's get into it and start at tier 3. So in this tier I've chosen to include the Armageddon Steel Legion, Mordian Iron Guard and Valhalla Ice Warriors. We'll start with the Ice Warriors first. Their regimental trait is one that covers a key weakness of the guard, which is that they tend to have a tendency to run away on the table, and this does mean that you don't have to focus in as many morale mitigation strategies for your infantry squads on the board, as only half as many will run to morale as normally would. I think that this is reasonably strong, though unfortunately can be fairly easily replicated by a couple of morale mitigation things, such as cheap commissars or something. Their option for vehicles is also interesting. Not degrading as fast is useful for a vehicle that hits on a 4+, you really don't want them to be hitting on 5s. And it's not a bad trait all in all for big titanic units such as Baneblades and things, who have far more likelihood of being shot half to death but not necessarily killed in one shooting phase. On the whole though, I don't really quite like these buffs for competitive play quite as much as others, just because they're a bit reactive as to what your opponent does. If your opponent is able to just focus on killing entire units rather than leaving any half damaged, you have the potential for getting absolutely nothing out of both halves of this trait. It certainly does put some more pressure on their firepower and target priority decisions, but I just don't think that this is enough to be worth it compared with picking something else. In fact, I think one of the strongest things about the Valhalla Ice Warriors is their excellent relic in Petros Mark 45. This is the bolt pistol that gives your company commander the power to blam conscripts and keep them basically pseudo-fearless all game. It's very fluffy for the Ice Warriors, and having fearless units of 30 is really quite powerful, even if they can't shoot quite as well as standard guardsmen. It has a really strong impact, meaning that you can secure objectives until every single one of those guardsmen is dead, and is far less likely to allow your opponent to chip away piecemeal at individual infantry squads. I think this nearly gets there, and if conscripts were either a little bit cheaper or a little bit better, then it would be more worthwhile. But at 4 points for only having ballistic skill 5+ and not taking orders very well, they're just not quite as efficient as they were at the start of 8th. I personally don't find their warlord trait, order or stratagem to be particularly powerful enough to see any sort of regular use. Moving on to the Mordian Iron Guard now, and they have the 5+ overwatch across their entire army, which is powerful but only against certain armies. Generally for competitive lists, you want something that can really handle the field, and if they just have that decent overwatch boost against armies that want to be rushing you, such as melee lists, then they're just going to be a fair bit more powerful against those matchups, but it's going to do you absolutely no good whatsoever if you're fighting another shooty army. Don't get me wrong, it can be powerful in the right circumstances, particularly on vehicles combined with defensive gunners, but even then I wouldn't typically be wanting to rely on Overwatch to do any meaningful damage, as it potentially means that you're letting your tanks get charged, which isn't a good idea. There's also plenty of ways of shutting down Overwatch, whether that's charging from out of line of sight, using a unit that ignores it, or potentially just charging a squad next door to it and consolidating into the target you actually want to tie up. so that is a potential weakness even against melee orientated armies. I'm not the biggest fan of their warlord trait or relic, unfortunately, and their stratagem, which used to be absolutely amazing, got heavily nerfed in a previous FAQ, and I was unfortunately very underwhelming. Their order is somewhat useful in being able to snipe characters with tooled up infantry squads, but I think that it's actually only ever going to be used fairly rarely, and most of the time you're likely to be better off just using first rank fire, second rank fire to flatly double their last gun damage output. Finally, we come on to Armageddon Steel Legion, whose longer range rapid firing up to 18 inches, is certainly helpful and will add up to more shots in game. Unfortunately, this can now be replicated as just one half of the custom regiments trait, and you could combine it with another more useful part of the second trait. Ignoring AP-1 on vehicles is certainly not really the most overwhelming. The majority of things that are going to be efficiently killing your tanks are not going to be AP-1, they're going to be AP-2 or better. Some armies might not even have any weapons that are AP-1, and as I said before, in competitive play you really don't want things that are better in one matchup, but almost entirely useless in another for the most part. If the rest of their options were any better, then I'd be a bit more convinced, but I'm not a big fan of their warlord trait or relic. Their stratagem isn't a particularly decent buff to their damage output, but their order is at least moderately useful in a mech list, allowing you to keep some infantry squads safe, although again you do have to give up them ordering something more useful such as first rank, second rank, which I think is usually going to be the better option to just get some more damage output out of them. So overall, I think that these three are the weakest out of our options for full guard regiments. I'm certainly not saying that you can't win with these guys, but I think that the win will be more due to the strength of the guard codex and the units itself, as opposed to any massive advantages that these guys have given you. In general, I think you are just going to have an easier time with other picks. So next we come to the second tier then, and these are the ones that I think are competitive options, and they can really shine when used on some specific units, but in general they aren't the sort of regiment traits that I would pick an entire army of if I was going for full competitive. Here I've chosen to include the Talon Desert Raiders, the Vostroyan Firstborn, and the custom regiments that are infantry focused. I'd say potentially the best out of these for forming a full army is probably the Talon Desert Raiders. I was a bit tempted to include them in tier 1, but I'm just not sure they're quite as strong as the other options there. Their trait of moving and shooting with vehicles without suffering the heavy weapon penalty makes it absolutely optimal on a lot of our light armour units. It's great on things like Sentinels, Chimeras and Tauroxes, things that have decent movement and both really want to be moving and still shooting with their heavy weapons, where on most other regiments they'll be hitting on 5s, which really hamstrings any sort of offensive damage output that they have. It's also great for including things like sponsons on Lehman Russes, and can also be kind of funny on artillery, meaning that you can be moving Hydras, Basilisks and Wyverns a very long way per turn, and still firing with absolutely no impact on their shooting. Their infantry part of the trait, being able to advance and still fire, is certainly powerful, and it will add up to a fair more shots over the course of the game, or if not, then more movement and more optimal positioning, which should lead to more objectives, more pressure on the enemy, and probably getting closer for more weapons in rapid fire. On top of all this, their tank order is absolutely excellent. It essentially allows you to move with your tank commander, shoot it, and then move it again, meaning that you can potentially pop out of cover, fire some shots off, and then jump back into cover. That's some proper old school Tau jump shoot jump shenanigans going on there. It does require having adequate terrain to be able to pull it off, and the enemy army not just being able to fly around the back and shoot you. But in theory, if you can get this off, it can be incredibly powerful and very frustrating for your opponent to deal with, as ideally most of the time they'll be wanting to shoot tank commanders very early. On top of this, their 3 command point stratagem to outflank a bunch of units is really handy as well. Even if you just throw a bunch of infantry squads behind enemy lines, then that can give you a solid threat to try and secure some backfield objectives. Or you can potentially use it for keeping armoured units off the board, that's making sure that you get the first strike on the enemy rather than them being able to shoot you first. It could also be handy for getting closer ranged units such as Demolishers or Punishers closer to the enemy to guarantee they at least get one round of shooting with their main gun. Overall, I do really like the Talon, and they're really not a bad choice for a full mechanised type list. The main reason that I've chosen not to include them in tier 1 is just because I'd only really be wanting to use it on things like tank commanders and more mobile elements such as Sentinels and Chimeras and things. In general, though mobile artillery is very fun, I do think that one of the more damage dealing buffs are more useful on them. So in competitive lists I typically only take a detachment of Talon as opposed to taking an entire army, though taking an entire army of Talon does certainly bring advantages. They are a solid regiment. Next up in this list we have the Vostroyan Firstborn, who similarly to the Talon I'd be more tempted to take in a small quantity rather than across the entire list. Their regimental trait of heirloom weapons to get plus 6-inch range to 24 inches or greater rapid fire and heavy weapons is incredibly handy both on infantry and on vehicles, but I think that their single biggest advantage is when you use it on demolishers or Punisher tanks to be able to get those very efficient weapons in 30-inch range, which means that you don't have to drive forward and expose yourself to counterattacks or potentially being charged into close combat. I'd say probably the primary reason I haven't included this as top tier is because you can now do the exact same thing with the custom regiment tank traits, and you can also take a very useful vehicle buff on top of that, which I think in general is going to outperform it in competitive play. You do lose the advantage of longer range lasguns though, so they do certainly have something. And I think the other single biggest draw to the Vostroyan Firstborn is their excellent and easy to use Firstborn Pride stratagem, which is just a nice simple 1 command point for +1 to hit on 1 unit. It's really handy to have around. If you have a few tank commanders with demolisher cannons in your Firstborn detachment, then you can throw this on the one that is the most critical to be able to achieve its damage this turn. It's very handy for things like plasma cannons as well, or if you're fighting anything with -1 to hit modifiers. It's another reason why I think that a smaller detachment of these guys is generally going to be better. You can only use this stratagem on 1 unit per turn, so having absolutely tons of them means that you get diminishing returns in my opinion. Vostroyans really aren't too bad a shout for a loyal 32. The guardsmen can camp on objectives with slightly longer range lasguns, meaning that they have a bit more chance of doing something meaningful while they're sitting there, and you can potentially throw in a tank commander or 2 into your army, one of which you can keep on using +1 to hit with each turn for some incredibly deadly demolisher or punisher firepower. Finally, in the second tier of regiments, I've chosen to include the infantry focused traits for the custom regiments. Now the two that I think get here in terms of competitive play are Wilderness Survivors plus Disciplined Shooters for a strong infantry orientated battle line. Wilderness Survivors is the one that gives you essentially your guardsmen in cover if you haven't advanced this turn, and they have FAQ'd that, meaning that if you move, it does count as advancing, which does limit its utility a tiny bit. Disciplined Shooters is essentially the Armageddon trait with the +6-inch range to rapid fire, so they'll be rapid firing within 18-inch range. Overall, this gives you a flat infantry battle line that's just both more shooty with the amount of shots it'll get on average, and also more survivable, typically having a 4+ save unless you go advancing. When guard infantry armies can put well over 200 or even over 300 models on the table, every one of those having a 4+ save wherever they are on the table is going to be an absolute nightmare for your opponent, and if they can't ignore cover with their army, then they're going to have a bad time trying to chew through all of those bodies. I think the Disciplined Shooters is a little bit less strong, but I think it's the second best out of all of the custom regiment traits that focus on infantry, as turn on turn it will more reliably add up to extra damage on the enemy over the course of a battle. You do lose the advantages of any special stratagems, warlord traits, relics or orders for these guys with this, so there are trade-offs, and I think in most competitive lists I think about using these guys for infantry and then maybe having some sort of special tank focused regiment, either a custom one or one of the other regiments, to provide some decent fire support for a strong infantry battle line. I will just mention Lord's Approval and Slum Fighters here as well. These are two traits that help buff guard combat, and in my opinion they do nearly get there in terms of making guard close combat viable, but I just don't feel they're quite as strong as Kaschan overall, mainly because the Kaschan trait also helps tanks, and you get access to Iron Hand Strachan, whose extra attacks I think make Kaschan the better melee guard army overall. The combo certainly isn't bad, but in my mind it doesn't quite get there for competitive play. So overall, I think that these 3 regiments can absolutely be part of a top tier competitive guard army, but optimally I would tend to take them in reasonably small detachments, focused on the units that get the most out of the traits. So now we come to the best of the best, and the ones that I think are generally the best regiments that guard can play at the moment, and are typically fine to make up the majority of your guard army. Here I've chosen to include the Cadians, the Kaschans, and the custom regiments that focus on vehicle traits. The Cadians have an absolute ton of advantages and viable tools that they can use in a competitive army. Their regimental trait is great in a mainly shooting focused list. Rerolling 1s to hit when stationary is a really solid buff and really easy to use, as a lot of the guard units want to be sat there shooting stationary anyway, and getting flat extra damage out of them every single time they fire is just an absolute no-brainer. It's great with infantry, it's great with tanks, but in particular guard artillery gets an absolute ton out of this, as they're pretty guaranteed to be sat there stationary all game in the first place. On top of this, the Relic of Lost Cadia is a really decent one, giving you a reroll wound rolls of 1 aura for 1 turn is great against any list, particularly as you will cram quite a lot of units into that decent sized aura. It could be great in an artillery firebase. or it could allow you a lot more firepower even in an advancing infantry battle line, as you can even reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1 even if you move with this. While it's strong against any army, it's absolutely game changing versus chaos, and having 1 turn of 4 rerolls to hit and wound against a chaos army could easily be the difference between victory and defeat, and means that you could alpha strike a large proportion of the chaos force off the table if you manage to get a lot of your tanks or artillery in range of it for a turn. Their unique warlord trait I think does compete at least fairly well with getting more command points and old grudges. Getting some extra orders is always helpful. Their unique order on Leman Russ tanks is great for rerolling the number of shots for their turret weapons, which means that if they don't move they can be pretty much on a par with Kaschan tank commanders, being able to reroll 1s and also reroll the number of shots. As part of their regiment traits, they also get better take aim, meaning that they're the strongest infantry firebase out there. With an order, you can have your heavy weapon teams re-rolling 4 rolls to hit, so they're far more efficient than their equivalent in other regiments. You get access to their unique special characters, including Tank Commander Pask, who is very competitive, and Creed and Kell, who have some interesting attributes, particularly Creed being able to get a couple of extra command points if you nominate him as your warlord. Finally, I think that one of the strongest draws to the Cadian trait is the fact that they have overlapping fields of fire for 2 command points, which is one of the strongest stratagems in the whole Guard book. Once you've chipped off a wound on an enemy unit, 2 command points can have your entire army hitting on +1 against that unit, meaning that in terms of a damage per command points investment, this easily has the potential to be the strongest stratagem in the Guard book. It means the majority of your Guard army is going to be hitting on 3s re-rolling 1s against this one target, well over a 50% buff compared with other regiments. It's just really good, and if you want a Guard gunline army, then Cadians are pretty much your best pick in a competitive setting. Next up we have the Kaschans. I've already talked about them many times on the channel, and I'm sure I will again, but these guys are just another very strong all-round regiment, both in terms of shooting, but also give us the incredibly helpful tool of viable Guard melee. Strength 4 Guardsmen at 4 points a model, when you can get extra attacks from Strachan and a Priest, will literally outpunch Orcs point for point, which really is saying something. In general, if you're playing against Guard, typically you can just rush straight at them and tie them up in close combat. That's a bad thing for the Guardsmen, whereas Kaschans can turn that on their head. If you do that, then you're likely to get clubbed to death by a massive amount of muscle-bound men with lasguns and blades. It means your opponent will have to give up the midfield unless they want to be first rank, second rank fired, and then also charged in for even more light AP nothing attacks. They're a really threatening force on the table, and being able to be scary in melee is such a big asset for a Guard infantry battle line. Sometimes you just need a bit of close combat in a competitive army. You might be locked into something that you can't fall back from, meaning that a countercharge element is the only way to deal with them. On top of that, the basic troops also get some leadership mitigation, in that their company commanders also give +1 leadership to the troops around them, meaning that you don't need commissars half as much, and it will mean that you typically lose less models to morale over the course of several games. On top of these great buffs for the infantry, you also get very strong vehicle damage output, as they get to reroll the number of shots every time they fire a weapon that has a multi-shot profile. This will typically equate to a 16% increase in damage output on any D3 weapons on D6 shot weapons. It's not quite as universal as the Cadian one, as that applies the 16% increase to everything, but it has the advantage that you still get this when you move and shoot, and also applies to flame weapons such as on hellhounds and things. Of course, you can access this exact same thing from a custom regiment, as we'll talk about in a second, but I think that the advantage of Kaschan is that you combine this pretty decent tank trait with an absolutely excellent infantry trait, meaning that you can happily put both tanks and infantry in the same detachments, and it makes it very easy to not have to segregate your army into different chunks. We already mentioned Strachan, who's a very good deal for a company commander. He's fighting himself and he gives that great +1 attack aura, as well as doing everything that a normal company commander would. And we also have Harker as well, with Payback the buffed heavy bolter, and giving reroll 1s to any Kaschans when shooting nearby him is really solid, both for parking in the middle of an artillery firebase or moving up alongside an advancing Kaschan infantry line. Overall, the Kaschan regiment is just a great one for the majority of units in your Guard army. The only things that don't really get anything out of it are tanks that have a fixed number of shots, such as Leman Russ Punishers and things. They're certainly a highly competitive choice. Finally, we have the custom regiment traits, and I think that a bit above the infantry ones, there are 3 options for tank custom regiment traits that when combined together provide some of the most powerful armour that the Guard can field right now. Those 3 are jury-rigged repairs, spotter details and gunnery experts, and I think that any 2 of those is very competitive on vehicles. Jury-rigged repairs is the one that basically allows your tank to heal a wound on a 2+, and if they roll a 6 then they heal D3 wounds. It's basically your entire Guard army's vehicles regenerating wounds in a very similar way to It Will Not Die from previous editions, meaning that your opponent can't even be happy that they've just bracketed a tank. It might just get back to be firing more accurately later in the game, and this trait will essentially just keep on putting more wounds of vehicle on the table for free, turn on turn. This one is really quite a psychological blow for your opponent as well, as you really don't want to be seeing the tough armoured vehicles that you've worked hard to try and take wounds off gradually be growing those same wounds if you're not able to kill them fully. Next we have spotter details, which is the plus 6-inch range for heavy weapons on vehicles, and is essentially very similar to the Vostroyan one, which as we said is great for the Lehman Russ Demolisher and Lehman Russ Punisher. In particular, Demolisher cannons have an excellent damage profile now, and they're some of the most efficient ranged anti-tank in the whole Guard army, and certainly up there in the wider game of 40k. They were already good in Vostroyan, and now you can get access to either jury-rigged repairs and gunnery experts on top of that. It just means in raw strength, these Demolishers or Punishers are just going absolutely through the roof. Not much more to say about this. 30-inch range is a lot more flexible, you'll be in range of more, you won't need to be as close to the enemy, it's all good. And it'll also help add things like 36-inch range weapons as well, where the range difference will matter more than you expect in my experience. Finally, we come to Gunnery Experts, which is essentially just the Kaschan vehicle trait, allowing you to reroll the number of shots on multi-shot weapons. Again, this synergizes beautifully with the Demolisher, so you can now have the advantage of having a 30-inch Demolisher cannon that rerolls the number of shots, making them incredibly scary threats on the table. A spearhead with a tank commander with a Demolisher cannon, leading 3 Lehman Russ Demolishers into battle. When combined with these two traits will be a threat that the opponent just really cannot afford to ignore. 30-inch range will give them better target choice, and rerolling the number of shots will mean that each standard Demolisher will do an average of 8 wounds a turn to your standard toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. If the tank commander tells himself to reroll ones, then he'll be doing 13. Overall, I think that any combination of these two traits is excellent together. Perhaps jury-rigged repairs and gunnery experts for artillery, as the extra range doesn't matter as much for them. Or maybe jury-rigged repairs and spotter details for anything that doesn't care about the number of shots it's firing, such as Lehman Russ Punishers for example. The main trade-off being that you don't get any unique warlord traits, stratagems, relics, or any advantages for any infantry in the same detachment, but I personally think that the raw strength of these things makes them push through, and you can focus the other stratagems, relics, and other bits and bobs as part of your wider army. You also do have the potential to combine any one of these with one of the infantry traits if you did want a bit more of a mixed detachment. You felt that either wilderness survivors or disciplined shooters could be really handy for your infantry, so there is scope for some flexibility there. If you're fielding an entirely tank army or a majority tank army though, then these custom regiment traits are an absolute godsend. So that's my basic rundown of the most competitive Guard regiments as I see them and why. I'd certainly be interested if anyone has any opinions as to whether I should have ranked anything higher or lower on the list, and what they feel really translates into winning more games with the Guard. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more Guard content coming out every few days. And if you have been watching regularly, then the channel does have a Patreon page, which is what allows me to focus so much time on making all of these YouTube videos. Making each one does take a good couple of hours now, and I do release 2 a day, so that adds up very quickly. It's only through the generous support of the Patrons that allows me enough time to focus on this, so if you are enjoying, then any support is greatly appreciated. The link is in the video description down below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.